Welcome to In Business Magazine's first virtual event. My name is John Konarski. I'm publisher of In Business Magazine, and I know that many of you have had to drastically change your work structure and business processes at this time, and we at In Business are no different. With stay-at-home orders and social distancing at the forefront of everything we do, we are excited to bring you a virtual installment of our Icons in Business series. This quarterly series was formed to showcase local iconic companies, organizations, and people influencing the business landscape. We've always had our speakers share with us valuable lessons they've learned leading these iconic companies, as well as some of the current challenges and opportunities that they're facing. Well, most of us right now are facing new challenges that we did not anticipate just a few months ago. So I'm sure we can all learn something from local business leaders at this time. One local organization that is certainly facing changes due to the COVID-19 pandemic is the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. And today we're thrilled to have CEO Joe Loehnis joining us for this first virtual Icons event. Joe will be leading the discussion on how the novel coronavirus has impacted WCO and is affecting the arts industry, both locally and globally. We'll turn things over to Joe in just a moment, but first I'd like to thank our sponsors that make the Icons in Business series possible. Our presenting sponsor is WPS Health Solutions. For nearly 75 years, WPS Health Solutions has been a leader in the insurance industry and a nationally regarded health benefits administrator for Medicare and active duty and retired military personnel and their families. Today, I'd like to welcome in Scott Kowalski, Executive Vice President of Marketing and Communications for WPS Health Solutions, to share a brief message on behalf of WPS.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Kowalski, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Marketing and Corporate Communications at WPS Health Solutions. WPS is proud to be a sponsor of the first ever virtual Icons in Business presentation. On a personal note, I couldn't be more happy to be able to wear a tie for the first time in 2 months. I'm looking forward to hearing from Joe Loehnis, CEO of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra, about change and innovation in this time of Corona. The WCO has been around for 60 years, but it's safe to say that they've never faced anything quite like COVID-19. We'll hear how the WCO and the arts community is responding to social distancing and other challenges. I'm glad to report that WPS has weathered the COVID-19 crisis well so far. As a government contractor and health insurer, it's essential for us to keep operating at full force. We started preparing weeks before the governor declared the safer at home order, so we were ready to go when it happened. We went from 38% of our 4,000 employees working remotely to 93% in just under 2 weeks, without losing productivity. I'm proud to say that our business continuity has been remarkably smooth, and we've continued to maintain our high standards of service to our customers. We've also been mindful to give extra care and attention to our customers and employees. We've reached out to remind them that we're here for them during these challenging times. And we've also created a special webpage on our website to share information on COVID-19. If you'd like to check that out, you can find it at wps.health/COVID-19. Our next initiative is to provide free face coverings to our more senior policyholders. We've been providing additional support and resources to our employees and encouraging them to share stories of gratitude, which I'm pleased to say they've been doing in abundance. We don't know what the future holds, but we're confident we'll come out of this stronger as an organization. WPS is also grateful for the active duty military and veteran doctors, nurses, public safety professionals, and others who are helping their communities get through the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be recognizing one of them with the WPS Military Salute Award. To learn more or to submit a nomination, and I encourage you to do so, go to wpsmilitarysalute.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. If you'd like to hear more about WPS or our COVID-19 response, please send me an email personally at scott.kowalski@wpsic.com. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Scott, and to everybody with the WPS Health Solutions team. I'd also like to acknowledge our premier sponsors of this year's Icons event series. Our first premier sponsor is Action Coach. If you're a business owner or leader who needs to change your business model right now to survive and flourish long term and wants a fast plan to see a path forward with economic opportunities, then Action Coach of Wisconsin can work with you to get clear, get out of overwhelm, and back to business. Thank you, Action Coach. Our second premier sponsor is Baker Tilly, a leading advisory, tax, and assurance firm dedicated to building long-lasting relationships and helping you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Thank you, Baker Tilly. Our third and final premier sponsor is the Madison Concourse Hotel. This is Madison's premier hotel located in the heart of downtown, and we do hope to be back there soon doing these Icons events in person again. But a very special thank you to all four of our sponsors this year for their flexibility as we've had to pivot to this virtual format. Okay, well, it's time to start our program here today and introduce our Icon speaker, Joe Loehnis. Joe, who is a professional cellist, became CEO of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra in the summer of 2019. Prior to the WCO, Joe served as the executive director of the First Tee of South Central Wisconsin, a global youth development organization teaching and reinforcing life skills through the game of golf. During his 6-year tenure, Joe drove an increase in participation from 8,000 to over 15,000 youth and increased revenue from 200,000 to 900,000. He chaired the National Advisory Board of Executive Directors, reporting directly to the organization's global CEO. Before we turn things over to Joe, I do want to mention if you have questions during the presentation, we'd like to encourage you to add them to the chat box. We'll be moderating them for a live Q&A following Joe's presentation. So submit them there, and we'll look forward to that at the conclusion of our program here today. With that said, it is my privilege to now turn things over to Joe Loehnis.
Well, good morning, everybody in the in-business community. Thank you to John Konarski, the publisher, and the sponsors for this program, the title sponsor, WPS, Baker Tilly, Madison Concourse, and Action Coach. It truly is an honor to be a part of this series. I was at the January session with Dan Brown, and to be a part of this and to share about the art space at this moment in our history is pretty special. So thank you for this opportunity and for the opportunity for WCO. You know, the arts sector has been impacted dramatically by the pandemic. You know, some say we're the first to close and the last to open, but I do recognize there are so many other sectors struggling right now. And particularly our healthcare sector, just heroes, frankly, for everything that's going on. So I feel very humbled to share a little bit about the arts space at this moment in time. So the overarching theme for today's talk really is, you know, in moments of crises, I think humans have a tendency to look for connection, to find meaning in things. And the WCO and the arts community in this moment in time is trying to find ways to remain relevant and nimble and to continue to provide connection for all of us to help us get through and to have hope. So that's really kind of the theme for today on how we are staying relevant and nimble. And I've divided the talk this morning into 4 parts, really. I'm going to talk first a little bit about the WCO and our impact on the community. Then I'll transition over into how we've responded to the coronavirus pandemic thus far. Then I'll talk kind of looking ahead, kind of the 12 to 24 months about how this sector is preparing for sort of all this uncertainty ahead. And then I'll close with kind of the latest on our summer series, Concerts on the Square, which has been a fixture of Madison for 37 years. And I'll be honest, I think like a lot of us, this is uncharted territory. We're making the business plan as we go. So, you know, I don't have all the answers. I've been in my tenure here at WCO for 8 months. So, you know, I'm speaking from my vantage point at this moment in time. And I think if there's any certainty that I have right now is that I'm starting to understand and know what I don't know. And I hope that can help fuel some of the business decisions that we make at the WCO. So to provide a little bit of context about me, I grew up in Wisconsin, in Appleton, Wisconsin, and my career thus far has been fueled by my 2 passions growing up. I fell in love with golf and cello from a very early age, and I've kind of had parallel paths throughout my high school, collegiate, and career so far. When I was 16, I became a cellist with the Green Bay Symphony Orchestra. I went on to school at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, where I received a cello performance degree and played collegiate golf. And then after college, I put the cello aside and spent 5 or 6 years down in Florida chasing my dream to play on the PGA Tour. And I say that because it was down there that I sort of had a realization of how I can leverage my passions and skills to serve others. I actually opened up a teaching cello studio and taught 30 students down there while I was playing on the mini tours. And I also mentored young kiddos on the golf course. So that really was like an inflection point for me as I came out of chasing my dream and moved to Madison in 2013 with my wife. I knew I wanted to serve others. So I actually had a great opportunity over the last 6 years to become executive director of the First Tee of South Central Wisconsin, which is based in Madison. And this is a nonprofit that serves kiddos and reinforces life skills through the game of golf. And during that tenure, we serviced 15,000 kids in South Central Wisconsin. During that time, I did pick up my MBA at UW-Madison. And when this opportunity at the WCO came about, it just seemed like the perfect confluence of my passion, my interest in serving others, and my understanding and knowledge of Madison and my fast love for falling in love with Madison and wanting to raise a family here. So hopefully that context provides you a little bit about who I am, and it's really fueled what I've done thus far in my career. So let's start by talking about the WCO, Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. It's been around for 60 years, but what it's most known for, and when it started in 1984, was Concerts on the Square. It's one of those summer activities in Madison that's one of the many fixtures of what makes Madison so great this summer. To date, we've had close to 6 million visits downtown Madison for Concerts on the Square. It's 6 concerts. It's the last Wednesday in June, and it has evolved so much in its 37-year history. So from an economic standpoint to downtown, it's dramatic. I mean, we have 30, 40, 50,000 people coming every week to Concerts on the Square, and it really is sort of our flagship and what we're known for in this community. But what's interesting about this organization is it has expanded so much beyond Concerts on the Square. When the Orchestra Center opened in 2004, we really added a strong and increased our indoor masterwork series. So while we're really present in the summertime, we have an incredible winter series at the Orchestra Center in the Capitol Theater for 5 Fridays in the wintertime. And that draws a crowd to really hear sort of the amazing caliber of our musicians in an indoor setting. The other areas that I think our music director, Andrew Sewell, has really embellished over the last 20 years is our education program. We have 4 flagship education programs, our Family Series event that goes out twice a year to the community, mainly at community centers. We have a Lucier Strings program that teaches young kiddos who wouldn't ordinarily have the opportunity to participate. We give them one-on-one private lessons with our musicians. We have a young concerto competition winner each year. We have a competition, and they play at Concerts on the Square, which is an incredible opportunity. And then every other year we play with the Wisconsin Youth Symphony Orchestra in a side-by-side. So one of the pillars and one of the strong things that we do as an arts organization is to provide education and outreach opportunities for the next generation to build skills and to be lovers of music and productive citizens in the future. One of the anchoring things about this organization are our musicians. When I did a listening tour early on in my tenure, all of the people that I spoke to kept coming back to our musicians and the caliber of our musicians. Our musicians come from all over the country, as far away as California and Pennsylvania, and they love playing for the WCO because of the artistry and the caliber of our musicians. And what's interesting, and this is a good educational piece, a lot of people when they hear orchestra, they think 100 musicians on stage. For a symphony, that's true. For a chamber orchestra could be anywhere from 5 to 30 musicians. And the significance of that is quite huge because in a smaller ensemble, you can't hide behind a section. I mean, you are the soloist. So the stakes are much higher. The listening that goes around is much greater in this orchestra. I'll give you an example. In Masterworks 1 this year, Suzanne Villa is our concert master for 25 years. In the 4th movement of the Italian Symphony, it just takes off. And you could just tell in the audience that all the musicians locked into her and Andrew, and they just moved as one organism through this final movement of this symphony. And I think the fans of the WCO really appreciate it about this group because they get wrapped into the music and feel the music. So it's an incredible experience. And, you know, the WCO has been so resilient, bringing in great talent and musicians to fuel our education programs, our masterworks, and our concerts on the square. So that's a little bit about the WCO, and we are celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, and we're excited to look at the next 60 years. So now I want to transition over to the pandemic, COVID-19. I remember when we knew internally that things were going to change really quickly. It was Thursday, March 12th in the afternoon, and we had to cancel one of our family series events. And like a lot of sectors of our economy, this thing hit hard and it hit fast. I mean, we went from having services lined up for the next 30 days to completely shutting down. So immediately as you think about what the future might hold, you think about your stakeholders. And we went straight to our musicians because most of our musicians are per-service musicians, and it's part of the gig economy. And right now, 95% of musicians in the gig economy right now aren't making an income the way they normally would. So it's hitting them really hard. So we called our musicians, we applied for the PPP, we got PPP money, and we were able to fund the services that were lost up through actually the end of this season. So we really wanted to make sure we could pay for and support our musicians during this really difficult time. Another thing is our patrons. The logistics of issuing refunds, exchanges, or receiving donations of 1,000 patrons for a concert is a lot. And it's been incredible, the response of our patrons. I think 80% of our patrons donated their tickets back to the WCO to support us through this difficult time. So that has been sort of critical and just sort of affirming for us just how much we mean to the community and how much we can provide for the community. But really, ultimately, we wanted to stay relevant and nimble, as I said at the top, during this time. So even though we can't play live, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation, we wanted to find a way to keep going. And what I'm about to show you is one of the first innovative things we did just weeks after the pandemic hit and everybody was shut down, to get our musicians out in front of our patrons. So with that, I will transition over to the first of, I think, 5 videos that you'll see this morning. All right, so we've come up on our first video, and I just realized I should take a moment. Some of you who have been following the WCO might notice that this presentation has a different logo system, and I want to point out that way back in November, we committed to a 6-month branding exercise with Suze Brewer of Suze Co. Suze is best known in this community for her work at Duluth Trading Company as their Chief Branding Officer and at Eat Street and VP of Marketing. She's just an incredibly talented brand strategist. And we took that on about 6 months ago. So it's meaningful to mention, A, because we have a new look, but that really fueled when the pandemic hit. We were 70 to 80% goal in terms of changing our brand and identity system, working on our season brochure, overhauling our entire website. So it was a very innovative time for our organization, and it kind of complemented where we felt as an arts organization that staying relevant and nimble through this time, and the fact that we had to forge ahead, I think really spoke to sort of the crux and the nature of arts right now, trying to just forge ahead. So if you see a new logo, that's why. And so first video, #Concerto series. This is a program we did for our musicians, for them to really stay connected to our audience. It was a volunteer exercise. I think we've had 16 out of our 30 core musicians participate, but it's a 2 to 3 personalized video to our WCO community, letting them know we're thinking of them, and most importantly, giving the opportunity for our musicians to share their talents. So what we're about to see is a compilation of about 6 or 7 of those, and they're still going on, and they're on our website. But Yeah, so we can check out the video now.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, my name is Brandon LePage.
Carl Levine here.
I'm Nancy McKenzie.
Midori Sampson.
Robin Hasselflug.
Joe Loehnis.
Alex Gooden here for the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra's hashtag Couch Airtoe series.
I wanted to share with you my arrangement of a song that's very special to me. Bayan Ko is one of the most recognizable songs in the Philippines, which is where my family comes from.
This little break has been difficult for everyone, but in my case at least, it's given me time to return to practicing some of the music of my first love, which was the piano.
I wanted to say thank you to all of my colleagues and to the Chamber Orchestra for putting this together. I hope that you enjoy this. Don't forget to wash your hands, stay safe, and I hope you're healthy.
So although social distancing has been hard for all of us, one of the benefits for me is that I get to spend more time with my family and making music with my family.
I'm sharing this because there's a lyric in the song that translates to something like, "Even the bird that's free to fly cries when it's in a cage." I'm feeling a little bit like a caged bird right now, sitting at home playing chamber music by myself, with myself, instead of with my colleagues of the WCO. So I'm sharing this for anyone else who feels a bit like a little caged bird right now.
About the hashtag Couchero series is it's all about the musicians. One of the things that Sue's discovered in her brand work with us and really reflected to us that we need to do more to make the stars out of our musicians. And it's all of our patrons love our musicians. They're super talented. So this Concerto series really highlights their talents and just their personalities. We want our fans to get to know our musicians. So I want to give you a couple more little snippets of how the sector, the orchestra sector, is innovating right now, using online digital to get some of their product out there. So the first one I want to show you is the French National Orchestra. This was, and you can click to that next slide. This is March 29th, Maurice Ravel. And just take a listen and I'll explain what you just watched. So go ahead and play the video. So what you just saw was an example of what orchestras are doing. All the musicians are at home right now and wanting to provide content for their patrons. So if you notice, some of the musicians had headphones that you could visibly see. They were listening to that piece of music, which is a stunning piece of music, and playing along and recording it and then submitting it, and somebody in the orchestra would mix it and pull it all together. So effectively, they were playing the symphony in the privacy of their own home, clicked together. And that was one of the earliest ones, which is pretty cool. It's a wonderful piece. What I'm about to show you next is, I believe, a couple weeks later, and I would just want you to notice any sort of more sophistication as this thing caught wildfire across the globe and all the orchestras were doing it. So the next one is the Pacific Symphony, April 30th. So about 30 days later, fourth movement of Beethoven 7. So check it out. as you can see from that video, there's a lot more going on. The Pacific Symphony, that was a month later after the first video, and it goes to show you that in a very short time, just kind of the sophistication of how all these orchestras tried to produce these in-home symphonies. It was just dramatic. So it was fun to watch from the art side how that had evolved. Just a couple last things about kind of how we responded locally. We, as an organization, set up a musician relief fund to help defray and some of the expenses, or said differently, provide resources to our musicians during this time when they weren't working and getting funding. So we actually launched the Musician Relief Fund with a stream of a previously recorded concert at the UW Hamlin Music Center on December 27th. We streamed it on March 27th and raised $10,000 to the Musician Relief Fund through the generosity of our patrons. And what was most striking to me about that performance, we had, through this hour and a half to 2 hour performance, about 2,500 people tune in at some point to watch the stream from 15 different countries, which is fascinating to me and might have some implications on future strategies. So that was interesting. And then we streamed last Thursday a concert on the Square rebroadcast, and we had another 1,000 people watch it. So we have some content that we wanted to provide, and a lot of orchestras have a much larger library, but streaming is another part of helping arts organizations stay relevant and provide hope for our community. The last thing, and then we'll get to the next section, is one of the things that has been really great is just how the arts community locally is coming together. The WCO is one of 10 resident companies at Overture, and we meet on a weekly basis, now bi-weekly, just talking about tactical issues, strategic issues. When is the hall going to open back up? How can we support each other? And I think that extends even beyond just the Overture resident companies. We have dozens and dozens of arts groups in town that are really working together to try to figure this thing out. And we can't overlook that because it's a really special thing that's what's happening right now with the arts community. So I now want to kind of pivot and talk about what's ahead for this sector over the next 12 to 24 months. So what's next? You know, this is kind of the million-dollar question for everybody, every sector of our economy. You know, what's been most surprising and shocking, I think, for all of us is just the level of uncertainty to do long-range planning, because we don't know if there'll be another spike, when the vaccine will be here. I think the variants for some of those are getting tighter, which is allowing us to do a little bit more strategic planning. But fundamentally, it's felt like a guessing game, and sort of the under your feet just keeps moving, so you have to keep shifting plans. So what I will say, though, is I feel very fortunate that we're in Dane County, and they've issued the Forward Dane report, which gives a roadmap to reopening. And I know right now we're in phase 1. But that framework is so helpful for our sector, because when you look at phase 3, for example, and it says that indoor spaces can have 100 people and outdoor spaces and festivals can have 250 people at phase 3, that at least gives you parameters to start running economic scenarios and projections on what's viable. So I think we're trending in that path, and it's helping sort of what the next 12 to 24 months could look like for our sector. So how I want to break this section or this part of the presentation down is sort of in blocks, like how I am thinking about our business. It's less linear in terms of time horizon because there's uncertainty there, but it's more how I'm thinking about each facet of our business. And I thought that would be a helpful way to share. I want to first talk about the economic implications and how do we keep the arts sector going to support the recovery efforts. And I'll just give you a few numbers here. This is from Arts Wisconsin. In 2016, the arts and culture sector of the Wisconsin economy accounted for $10.1 billion, 97,000 jobs. And if you benchmark that 97,000 jobs is more than the beer industry, the paper industry, and the biotech industries, and about $6 billion in wages. So this is a very impactful part of our sector. The U.S., it's approaching $900 billion, which is 4.5% of GDP. Thanks to Jason Ilstrip. Hi, Jason. Not sure if you're tuned in this morning, but he was quoted in a recent article saying that festivals and gatherings in Dane County or in Madison, for the downtown retail space, that accounts for 70% of their business. So the vast majority of business in downtown Madison is a result of festivals and gatherings. So just tremendous impact on our downtown economy. Currently, there's been about a $25 million hit to this sector in Wisconsin, with hundreds of millions of dollars of projected losses just in this summer alone. So pretty dramatic. So one of the things we wanted to do that we did at the WCO, and I know a lot of arts organizations did, is look at how the sector recovered during the Spanish flu, 1918. Because we wanted to learn from the past and see if we could apply some of those principles as we start our recovery now. What we found fundamentally is that the arts came back, and it came back with a boom. Now, this was wartime, so it was kind of on the other end of the war, but when you look at some of the stories about how patrons were yearning to get back for connection and to find meaning in their art, that was very evident during at the other end of the Spanish flu. It was slightly different because at the time there weren't as many substitutes. The flu hit harder over a shorter duration, and there was a little more lax in the reopening of sectors of the economy and community. So a little bit different, but fundamentally the arts patron wanted to come back. And I found this in Musical America. I thought I'd share. This was a disclaimer in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, one of their pamphlets right after Spanish flu, when all the patrons came flooding back to their hall. It said, "There will be threat of pains and penalties for the patron who should cough or sneeze without smothering the explosion in a handkerchief." So 100 years ago, they were thinking about aerosols in the air, but there are pictures of people with masks, but the Chicago Symphony was strongly warning people to cough and sneeze in a handkerchief. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. So, okay, so we looked at the history. What can we learn from the past? My next thing, how do we keep our musicians and artists working and safe? And those are two very important things. And sometimes they oppose each other because if we can work based on safety guidelines, are the musicians feeling comfortable to work? So not only is it on stage that we have to think about, and I'll talk about spacing issues in a moment, but the backstage of a lot of these indoor venues are very tight quarters. So all the logistics around getting the musicians in socially distant, spacing out their cases, figuring out traffic, and then coming on stage in a safe way. Those are all the considerations that we're thinking about right now for our musicians. And fundamentally, we want to try to get our musicians working as soon as possible. And we've asked our musicians, and they feel the same way, if they can do it safely. So just recently, a couple of weeks ago, some German scientists came out with a 13-page report outlining some of the safety requirements for musicians to safely get back to the indoor venue. Some of the numbers are not all unlike what we all experience with social distancing here in Dane County, but strings are 5 feet apart, winds and brass are 6 feet apart with plexiglass between them, percussion is 5 feet apart. Some of the interesting things with winds and brass is they're blowing air, so it's much more, I guess, there's risk than strings or percussion. And what I want to show you next is a performance May 9th from the Philharmonic Hildesheim, performance of Beethoven's 7 second movement, showing what a performance and the safety requirements, using the safety requirements, what it actually would look like to get back to the hall safely. So take a look, check it out. So as you can see with that performance of Beethoven's Seventh Second Movement, there isn't a lot of room for patrons. In fact, in that recording, there wasn't any patrons. The reality is that was a hall of 400 people, so it's not quite like Capitol Theater or Overture Hall that we all know. But it makes it very challenging to think about bringing the patron back if you have to spread your whole orchestra around the entire hall to play. So I found that to be a fascinating video just to see where we're at, and that was, again, in early May. Kind of the last thing we were thinking about for next season, some of these productions get mounted 12 to 18 months in advance, and you have to book these musicians and these soloists. Well, there's so much uncertainty coming down the pike on what we can economically do and what the appetite will be to get back to hear live music based on where the coronavirus is in its cycle. So we're looking at flexibility in some of our contracts, whether it's postponing concerts or reducing concerts, to give the orchestra and our musicians as much flexibility as possible. Again, that theme of nimbleness. If we need to, for example, postpone a Masterworks concert, which is 50 musicians, and reduce it down to 10 to 15 instruments so we can still perform, but do it in a safe way with the current restrictions. We're looking at ways we can have amendments to contracts so we can have that flexibility for the next season. The next thing my next content block is really the venues, and I've kind of hovered around this, but venues, how can they remain open for artists and patrons to come together and enjoy live music? As I said earlier, Forward Dane at Phase 3, you can have 100 people for a gathering inside. So it's when you look at the economics of putting on a concert right now, it's pretty cost prohibitive. As you're looking at the Capitol Theater and Overture Hall, how many patrons can you actually get in there with safety guidelines? And how is that going to impact your earned revenue, which is single ticket buys and subscriptions? So I want to show you a screenshot of a back of the envelope effort that somebody did with Boston Symphony Hall. So we don't have to look at this in detail. I just want to give you kind of the scope. So this is from the middle class artist, a guy by the name of Zach Finkelstein, did the back of the envelope calculation. This is the title, The Post-COVID Concert Hall Catastrophe, Why Audience Attendance is the Least of Our Problems. So he just took current guidelines and determined that Symphony Hall of capacity of 2,600 has to be reduced to 500, so effectively 80% reduction. In order to maintain earned revenue for the Boston Symphony in this scenario, they have to quadruple their ticket price. So what does that mean? The average ticket price is $50. If you quadruple that, you're now talking $250 ticket, which the Boston Symphony, I can guarantee you, wouldn't place that burden on the patrons, nor would I think the patrons want to pay that much to come enjoy this concert. So when you start to look at the economics on the earned revenue side to mount a concert, the economics look quite challenging. So contributed revenue, which is philanthropy, has to increase, or you have to modify your production to decrease costs so that you can match your costs with the earned revenue that comes in. So that's an economic problem that we are looking at pretty much every single day on how to mount productions with a vast reduction in earned revenue based on current health guidelines. Scenario that could be at the Capitol Theater for the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra this upcoming season. This is the Czech Philharmonic on April 25th, playing chamber music in a safe and socially distant way. So check it out. that recording we just heard, which interesting, and I don't know if this is by design, but it was a strings-only program. So strings might be safer to return sooner than winds or brass instrumentation. So it's just an interesting thing to think about as we try to remain nimble in our productions and programs. Another thing is just the size of the ensemble. So that would have been maybe 60% of the size of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. So next I want to talk a little bit about our patrons, you know, the lifeblood of any arts organization. You know, getting them back to live music safely, the patrons want to be there, but even with a vaccine and capacity of the hall, there's a psychological barrier of, is it safe? And a lot of our patrons are in an older demographic, which, as we know, there's more vulnerability to the coronavirus. So even if capacity-wise the halls can open up for our patrons, psychologically, will patrons come back? So that's one of the things we're doing is we're doing check-ins with our patrons. We're going to start doing surveys on a monthly basis just to see their appetite for coming back to the concert hall, and we hope to track this normative data just to see where they're at psychologically with the vaccine and with capacity opening up. I think keeping them engaged right now is more important now than ever. Staying relevant in their lives, giving them content, giving them an opportunity to voice their opinion and to hear what our vision is for the future as we all try to weather the pandemic. So the patrons are very important for us now and moving forward over the next 18 to 24 months. Kind of the last content block I want to talk about is streaming. And what do we do with streaming? As I said earlier, that we've done a few live streams. Some orchestras around the world are very sophisticated in their streaming. And this question of how can the technology of streaming provide long-term safety and sustainability for organizations? Can it replace the live concert experience? And in fact, I pulled another quote from during the Spanish flu. They were streaming 100 years ago in a different format, and here's the quote from the record industry marketing, the Edison phonograph in 1918. It said, "You can attend concerts of grand opera, light opera, sacred music, or the fine old songs without running the risk of contracting influenza." So when the Edison's phonograph was coming online 100 years ago, the recording industry was saying, stay home and listen to it. Well, we all know that live music has survived and thrived over the last 100 years. So I thought that was interesting that 100 years ago, arts organizations were trying to figure out how to continue to provide content for their patrons. To me, some of the cons of moving your strategy from long-term, from all live experience to streaming is you lose your loss of locality. Whenever you travel to a new community, arts and culture really gives you that feedback on where you are. And as soon as you put it up on streaming, you no longer have that locality. You're just an orchestra that could be playing anywhere in the world. I also think competition is certainly a barrier to make this a large part of your strategy. If we move our earned revenue strategy solely to streaming, or the vast majority to streaming, we now are competing with the Berlin Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera, which have about 100 years of archival recording that they're using to stream to their patrons all around the world. I think another challenge to doing streaming only is it's passive. It's not an active way to engage your patrons. There are little micro moments when you have live music where you can get to know your patrons and you can hear how their families are doing, and they can get to know you better. They can get to know you musicians. If you go to streaming only, you lose that opportunity. And then last, this concept that I love called asynchronicity, and it's this thought of kind of what I'm doing today. I'm recording this 5 or 6 days early. I don't have an audience to respond to, and then it's going to be played 5 or 6 days later. Well, the magic of live music is the patrons and the artists are one organism kind of feeding off each other. And when you're in the concert hall, you can feel it, whether you're a musician or whether you're a patron. And that asynchronicity of the streaming, no matter how quality the production is, you're going to lose that feeling. And we all know it when we go to a concert, what that feels like. So I think it's a strategy. I think orchestras and arts will have to adopt streaming. as a larger part of their earned revenue pie. But I see it as sort of a supplement through this period over the next 12 to 24 months, not ultimately replacing. And when we have a vaccine, you know, we're going to have to evaluate how much of our strategy will be in streaming. So kind of to wrap up this section for the future, you have to remain nimble. You have to remain relevant for your patrons. You know, we're all about delighting and inspiring our fans, and we're just going to have to be fleet-footed and constantly innovate to try to get through this on the other side when we can resume business as normal, however that's going to look like. I want to close with talking about Concerts on the Square. As I said at the top, this has been around for 37 years and has become one of the fixtures of Madison summer, drawing over 5.5 million people to the square since inception. So I found this throwback photo in the archives that I wanted to share. This is in March of 1984 in the Wisconsin State Journal. Pleasant Rowland, who at the time was the chair of the Concerts on the Square committee, her and Reed Coleman of the Norman Bassett Foundation and Frederick Miller of the Evu Foundation brought their picnic basket and a bottle of wine over to the square in March, kicking off the inaugural season. So it just kind of shows where this puppy started, and it's amazing how much it's expanded. So when the pandemic came in March and we were at Safer at Home, we were just beginning, we were in the middle of planning for Concerts on the Square, and we knew we had to do something to modify the season, but fundamentally our driving force has been to try to do something and provide a sense of hope for our community to be a part of something, whatever that something is. On April 9th, the first step we took was to move the dates back. Typically, with Concerts on the Square starts the last Wednesday in June. We moved it back 5 weeks to start on July 28th. Since that time, we have seen festivals canceling all around the country and locally. Big names like Tanglewood, Hollywood Bowl, Ravinia, the Lincoln Center, locally APT, Art Fair on the Square, and events that are still pending are the Ironman, Summerfest, and the Democratic National Convention. So it's amazing to see and understanding how much it takes to mount summer festivals, all of these cancellations. So since April 9th, we have been contingency planning nonstop, trying to figure out how to do it. And here are a couple of slides of Concerts on the Square as we know it. So this first slide, our table section, lots of people. The next slide shows all of the people on the grass. Concerts on the Square will not look like this summer if we can do anything. We are exploring alternative venues. I've been talking closely with the health department, just as last week, talking to Bonnie Koenig downtown. The square presents challenges for crowd control if we're in fact limited to 250 people. There are 16 different entry points, which makes it all but impossible to try to contain the crowd. So we've explored other venues, Bree Stevens, for example. We've looked at different scenarios for a number of patrons and looked at, in addition, if we can do live concerts, how can we distribute it maybe through simulcast audio or audio visual to try to, if it is in fact 250 people, we could essentially have pods of 250 people all around town through partnerships with, for example, the Madison Mallards and their drive-in movie theater, or the Madison Parks Foundation, who's trying to mount some parks events and replace a picnic at the park through their partnership with Event Essentials. So we're exploring all of these options, and actually when this recording gets sent in business for viewing next Wednesday, we may have a press release that day or the following day. The one image I wanted to show you is a picture from Domino Park in Brooklyn. This was on May 22nd in the Wall Street Journal. And as you can see, it shows pods of people socially distant in circles, actually, on the ground. That could be a potential scenario for Concerts on the Square and an alternative venue so we can control the crowd and keep everybody safe. One of the things we have to look at is the economics of mounting one or several Concerts on the Square. and we'll most likely postpone 4 concerts into next season and try to save the last 2 dates, which would be August 25th and September 1st, as live concerts. And if we can make the expenses and revenue work, as well as keeping everybody safe, and assuming we're in phase 3, we would try to mount something. And in the meantime, try to rebroadcast some previous concerts on the square in June and July. One more slide I wanted to show you. This is just kind of shows the nimbleness of this organization. This is, I think, from 1975, when we just went from the Madison Summer Symphony and renamed to the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. We were playing in parks all over Madison at the time. So it's interesting, the thread of this organization and its ability to be nimble and play in different venues. So I thought that was interesting to share. So as I think about it, kind of wrap this looking ahead up, is what we're trying to do at Concerts on the Square is probably what the arts sector is going to have to think about and act on over the next 18 to 24 months. How do we change our venue? How do we change our audience size? How do we change our productions? How do we find sources of revenue? How do we find different distribution channels to continue to keep art moving and art forward for this community? And it's really all about providing art for our community so we can have that human connection and uniting folks through this pandemic and giving people hope. So that's really, I think, the driving force for this entire sector. How do we survive? But how do we remain relevant and innovate for our patrons? And I guess I would say, if you have the capacity to give time, treasure, or talent to any arts organization, local or across the state or across the nation, we need support now more than ever. So it's a great opportunity to find organizations that are continuing to find meaning in your lives and support them. So again, I want to thank In Business and our sponsors for making this possible today. Truly an honor to share a little bit in this moment of time through this pandemic and how the WCO and the arts sector is handling the situation and making the best of it. And I look forward to this chat next Wednesday for a Q&A session. But thank you so much, and I hope everybody's safe and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that tremendous presentation today. We're now here live with Joe, as I promised earlier, and he will be taking some of the questions that you submitted throughout the program here today. So let's welcome Joe back for this live Q&A.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now be taking questions. To ask a question via the web presentation, go to the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, type your question into the text box, then click enter. And one moment for our first question. Joe, with the unfortunate current events over the past week, locally and throughout the entire country, how do you see the entire arts community coming together to help in the healing process, especially as we are also dealing with a pandemic preventing large groups from gathering?
Well, thanks for that question. First, I want to thank In Business again for this opportunity for the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra and the arts community. With the death of George Floyd and the gatherings over the last several days, my own personal journey has taken a whole new meaning. And while my presentation is certainly applicable and will remain applicable to the art space, that I've really, for the last several days, have taken a step back and think about my own personal journey and identifying, my own racism and owning up to that and finding a way to infuse some of those challenges that I know we all face, and how does that inform the work of the WCO moving forward. I think what I'm realizing is there are some systemic and structural issues even in the art sector, in the classical music space, which our music is really founded on colonialism. So there is a lot of work to be done for the WCO that extends far beyond some of the issues I identified during the pandemic, and finding ways to use our repertoire, our partnerships, our educational opportunities, and community access to be a part of part of the ongoing discussions and solutions and actions that we all need to take individually and collectively to move our communities forward. So it's definitely a time of reflection for us, and how do we mobilize to kind of use WCO as a platform to change the narrative and the behaviors of all of us. But I think one of the things that the arts community in general can do and has done since the beginning of time, it has an ability to unify and build bridges. It's a universal language, and I think in this moment in time, finding ways to turn to the arts to express ourselves is going to be very important today and in the future.
Great, thank you. Next question. How can we conceivably start concerts on the square July 28th, given the 14 days that phases and even the 250 limit for phase 4?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and we've certainly have gotten feedback about canceling the season altogether and regrouping for next year. And we're certainly not going to be starting on July 28th. As the health department is discussing right now, we have 14-day incubation periods to see if we can move on. Of live music for this summer is 250 people off the square at a different venue. We're looking at Breese Stevens Field, and frankly, it's tricky for us. We want to try to remain nimble and flexible as late as possible. And if I had to guess today, we'll probably make a decision by mid to late July if we can mount anything live on August 25th. But fundamentally, it's this kind of felt need for all of us to try in this moment to bring live music to our community if we can do it safely in a controlled environment, and give it an opportunity to again, as I discussed during the presentation, find innovative ways to distribute widely. So it's been challenging for us, and there's been moments when I just wanted to cancel and to just postpone to 2021. Andrew's created a really incredible lineup of programs this summer. So I would just say stay tuned, and we'll probably make an announcement early next week for what we're thinking at this moment in time.
Great, thank you. Next question. What is your vision for the next 18 months for Chamber Orchestra strategic for online future?
Yeah. What I said initially, I think this moment has reinforced all of us at the Chamber Orchestra just how much work we have to do as an arts organization to own up to our history of our art form, and how do we expand and change the paradigm of classical music, both in terms of our distribution, which obviously we talked about for online, but kind of more fundamentally, how do we be that true community partner that is providing access and education programs, and making sure that our music is reflective of the communities we serve, and that we make it a welcoming environment. I think that will be very much central to our narrative, both internally and how we operate, both locally and then around the state as we look at our expansion plans. So it's definitely a moment of reflection, and helping us evaluate and understand why we exist and what we can do to move our communities forward in this moment. So in terms of the online strategy, I think we will, until there's a vaccine, have to find a way to be available and provide art to our community in a modified format, and that most likely will be online in some form or fashion. So I don't think that's going to be, as I said in the presentation, a long-term big part of our strategy, but certainly it's something we have to adopt and implement in order to be effective now and in the future.
Great, thank you. Next question. Can you explain the difference between a chamber orchestra and a symphony orchestra and how they may have been affected differently?
Yeah, great question. Typically, a symphony has 100 musicians on stage, and a chamber orchestra could be anywhere from 15 musicians all the way up to 40. So size is one of the big differences, and with that is also the repertoire. But in terms of how the pandemic is going to influence these groups differently, when you look at indoor spaces and the size of the halls and the stage, the ability to have 100 musicians on stage creates a much bigger challenge than 20 musicians on stage. So I think symphonies are going to have to potentially, for the larger works with 100 musicians, wait longer to get back to perform. They might have to be more nimble on the repertoire and potentially have a instrumentation reduction to play different music to continue to perform for their patrons and community. Whereas the chamber orchestra, if it's a repertoire that's 15, 20 musicians, we may not have to pivot a whole lot to play an indoor concert safely with proper social distancing. So I think in terms of the pandemic, I think size is such a major factor just from the sheer volume of people that need to be on stage to perform a major symphony. So I would definitely say size is probably the number one difference that is going to be impacted by the pandemic.
Thank you. Next question. How has the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra's expansion to Brookfield to perform at Sharon, Lynn Wilson Center for the Arts been affected by the pandemic? Can you talk about plans for this expansion, amid all the cancellations?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And, as I was getting acclimated to this organization, I was looking at strategic plans from 10 or 15 years ago, and the expansion to Brookfield was there in the early 2000s. So this has been a goal of this organization for some time. This year our goal was to start to lay the groundwork for community outreach, community awareness. We had a multi-layered approach to our strategy through private corporate events, individual house parties, reaching out into the school districts to try to perform at school districts, bringing young kiddos to the Sharon Lynn Wilson Center for our family series, and then concluding our expansion plan this year with one of our Masterworks programs that typically happens at the Capitol Theater. I think we were 3 days out from sending a brass quintet to Elmbrook High School for 100 kids to receive a master class, and 2 of their ensembles there were going to perform for our brass quintet, and the brass quintet was going to conduct a master class and play. And 3 days before that, we had to cancel because of the pandemic. So we didn't even get started this year on our education and outreach plan to get into the community, and then we obviously had to cancel the rest of the season. So I think one challenge that we'll face next season is, as the pandemic persists and we can't have large gatherings, it's going to be harder for us to get into the community at the grassroots level and get to know the community and understand their needs and desires and appetite for what we have to offer. Whereas here in Madison, we have 60 years of legacy that is in this community. So we'll have to find different ways to enter that community that's going to be a little bit different than here in Madison, because we don't have that 60-year legacy over there. And I fundamentally believe that we can't be a fly-by-night arts organization that pops into the Sharon Wilson Center and plays our masterworks. If we're gonna build a new market in Wisconsin, it has to be from the ground up. We have to get to know the community leaders. We have to provide our services and offerings at the education realm first, and then build our way up to really showcasing the talents of our orchestra at the masterworks level. So it'll be interesting, but I think there's some similarities that we're facing here in Dane County, and just getting exposure to our community and providing them our services.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like that's all the time we have for questions. If your question was not answered, Joe will do his best to address those offline. Thank you for your attendance.
Well, folks, we did it. Our very first IB virtual event. I want to thank Joe Loehnis for working so well with us in this inaugural IB experience. So much great information about the WCO and how they're adapting during this time. I also want to extend our sincerest appreciation to the sponsors of this year's Icons program. Our presenting sponsor, WPS Health Solutions, as well as our premier sponsors, Action Coach, Baker Tilly, and the Madison Concourse Hotel. Thank you all for your flexibility and working with us as we pivot here to this virtual format. And a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in here today and attending this virtual installment of this Icons in Business series. We encourage you to be on the lookout for additional Icons events coming to you in this virtual format very soon. Thank you.